Well, thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Bennett. I believe that that's going to be a very hard standard to live up to behind the podium here, but I did have some very great years working together with Andrew. In our team, he's absolutely right. I am very proud of the team that I have and the very excellent support they give not only to me but to Export Development Canada and to Canadian exporters and businesses in your countries around the world, which I've really had the great and distinct pleasure of visiting many of your countries today. So thank you very much, Andrew, for your kind words today. And thank you all for being here today, for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. We are all very busy people, and to see a full room like this when our agendas are all very full, we thank you very deeply. It is also a great pleasure for me to have worked together with the Christian Embassy over a number of years, and to worship together with Darlene and with Harold, and to be able to enjoy that fellowship on an ongoing basis. Thank you very much, Darlene, for the work that you do for the Christian Embassy, and for inviting me to be with this great group today. Well, in fact, knowing how well-schooled this audience is, it makes it rather intimidating for me. It reminds me of a conversation that Winston Churchill had with a young member of Parliament who had just finished one of his first speeches inside of the Parliament. And he asked that master of wit how he might have put more fire into his speech. And Churchill responded that it would be better if he put his speech in the fire. Now, I'm not sure what Churchill might think of this speech or of my profession, as he is also known to have said that the future is unknowable. And of course, I'm trying to impart something of the future to you today. That's my profession. I'm an economic forecaster. If I'm not anything else, that's really what I am in terms of the work that I do. I do many other things, but that's predominantly what I do. Well, I can only imagine what scathing comment Mr. Churchill might add to the myriad economist jokes that are used with regularity when I and my contemporaries are being welcomed to podiums just like this. He might say something like, economic forecasting is the only profession that heaps rewards on those who are less wrong than the rest. It's true that the standard that we're held to these days is far more relaxed than in ancient times. Thousands of years ago, prophets were held to a standard of 100% accuracy. Otherwise, they were labeled heretics, and their lives were cut rather short as a result of that. But here I find myself in this profession all too aware of its past missteps. But with all due respect to Mr. Churchill, I am determined, call me naive, that the future is indeed knowable. Not by the likes of me or those in my profession. I believe very firmly that there is a divine power that very much knows the future as well as knowing the past. The future is not a thing for humans to know, but knowing that the future is knowable gives hope to the likes of me and gives hope to all of us, actually. And so we endeavor by various means to do our best to shed light on the current world state, where it is headed, and advise as best we can. And it's clear over the last decade that has been a very strenuous task. As Andrew has said, I've been at the art and science of economic forecasting for 30 years, and the past 10 have definitely been the most challenging. On that score, my former boss, friend, and the current governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Poloz, proved to be a much better forecaster than I. You see, he handed over the position of chief economist at Export Development Canada to me in June of 2008. mere days before the global economy started lapsing into its greatest global recession since the Great Depression itself. At least from that, you can conclude that the Bank of Canada is in good hands. One of the great lessons I learned in forecasting is that it is greatly aided by a solid knowledge of the past. It is often said that those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. That is often true in economics and perhaps even more true in our information-rich world. More than once, I have wondered aloud if the exponentially increasing deluge of data and information is daily displacing our grasp of history, even short-term history, to the extent that recent correlations embedded into financial models can pose a grave threat to or even cause the near collapse of the financial superstructure of capitalism in a matter of days or minutes. My team has often heard me say about the economy that if we don't know where we have come from and we don't know where we are right now, then we have no business projecting the future. A solid understanding of the economic journey and a sense of where that journey has brought us is essential to having even a modicum of confidence in talking about the future, and to those who are staking their livelihoods on it. So here I come to the point in my talk where I discuss how it is that we actually see the world. And the title of today's presentation, you've told me as you were walking in today, has gripped you. Everybody wants to know when the next recession is going to be. Everybody wants to know why it is that stock markets are in as great turmoil as they are in at the moment. Why the yield curve seems to be starting to invert. Why leading indicators of economic activity appear to be heading in the wrong direction. And there is slowness inside of the data at the moment, of course, that is corroborating all of these fears that we have. Are we 10 years beyond the last recession, on the verge of another recession? Well, the perspective that I would like to put on that today is not what you will hear from the average forecasting economist on Bay Street, in academic institutions, and elsewhere. Because we believe fundamentally that the journey that the economy has been on over the last 20-plus years demonstrates that technology, together with the inexorable reach of globalization, has taken a 10-year business cycle and has stretched it over 20 years. Now, that might be an oversimplification to this audience here, but this is not something that is discussed in the discourse, in the general discourse on the world economy at this point in time. And I think if this is actually true, it has stunning implications for business strategy decisions, for policy decisions of a number of different types. So how do we actually characterize this? Well, we take a look at the last business cycle, and for all intents and purposes, absent a shift that occurred back in 2001 when the tech sector was in disarray, we had a 16-year growth cycle. A normal growth cycle would be 8 years. So when you have a 16-year cycle, something strange happens along the way. When you go beyond that time where you should have had a correction, somebody like me, not me, but like me, stands behind a podium like this and says some very difficult words. It is different this time. And that gets us into a lot of trouble, because as growth goes past previous barriers, we begin to believe that it is different this time. And what do we do with that different? Well, what we do with it is to say, well, if we can grow for longer, and if we can grow forever, as some alleged at the time, without interruption, we've hit this new normal where we're going to continue growing forever, then we can lower our risk threshold on all the decisions that we make, politically and in business. And what that led us to was a supercharged period of global growth that lasted somewhere between 5 and 7 years. It generated a monster bubble of excess in the world economy. And anytime there is a monster bubble of excess, you know there is at some point in time going to be a very large correction that occurs. And that's exactly what happened in 2008. That's why it was magnified as much as it was. That's why we got into abject panic at the time and decided that we needed to pour as much stimulus as the world saw that it could afford to raise ourselves up from the depth that we had fallen to and to preserve the financial system from going into collapse. We were on the verge of all of those things, and stimulus actually rescued us from that. But that stimulus revealed that many world leaders, with all due respect, everybody was in on this, so nobody is left out of this comment that I'm going to make. But world leaders proved that they had a lot of difficulty with grade 3 math. Because somewhere along the continuum, as they were spending hundreds of billions of dollars this quarter to replace the hundreds of billions of dollars they had spent in the previous quarter, they failed to realize that it was the same amount of money and that there wasn't an economy that was taking the bait and growing underneath all of that. And so one quarter over the other quarter is, you all know, zero growth. And so leaders were standing up and saying, I don't understand why the economy isn't working because I am cutting big checks every quarter to get the economy going again. Those big checks were replacing all of the checks that were written in the previous quarter, and there was no growth. And why have we lived through a protracted period of substandard growth? There are many structural reasons that are given for this, but folks, when we have a monster 5 to 7 year bubble of activity, we are going to have a monster period of very sluggish growth so that we can get rid of that excess inside of the economy. And it happens in the consumer sector, it happens in the investment sector, it has manifestations all over the economy. So where does that bring us to now? Well, we've had this protracted period of some substandard growth, and all of a sudden, things started picking up. And once again, people didn't understand why it was that we would be picking up now. Well, our simple explanation for that was the excesses are exhausted. So enjoy yourself. Get on with those investment projects. Let's get our economy back to normal. And it indeed was doing that all on its own. And so we have a period where we are actually getting back to normal growth, believe it or not. It's not a new normal, low growth scenario that we have out there. The economy was actually picking up on its own. Investment was remarkably, with no policy coming into place to actually get it going, getting up on its feet all on its own. The Trump tax reductions in the United States came after the investment wave started to pick up. They've augmented it, but they didn't cause it. And so here we are right now at a great crossroads where growth is rising for the first time in a long while. And onto that we drop what? All kinds of policy confusion. So businesses who would otherwise naturally invest at this point in time are holding back. They're holding back because they don't know what the architecture is going to be. You see, behind all of this, with substandard growth, many have been left behind. And economists want to talk to us about all the structural reasons why these people have been left behind. One of the prime reasons that never gets discussed is that growth was substandard. And if growth is going to pick up again, then naturally these displaced people should be coming back into the economy again. And folks, one participation rate after the other, age cohort by age cohort, in the United States has demonstrated that without any kind of policy action, on any politician's part, this has naturally started to occur again. The economy is healing itself after all of these years. Well, I as an economist stand back from that and think this is a remarkable thing that's actually going on. So our difficulty at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, is not whether we're going to fall into a recession. Folks, if we have pent-up demand in the two engine economies of the world, Western Europe and the United States, which I can show you plain evidence of, that's not a bubble of excess activity. That's the opposite. That's actually a cavern of demand that needs to be filled, and growth will do that. Well, if you have an anti-bubble out there, I have a very hard time going out there and saying the economy is ready for its next recession. Now, we don't have time to go into all of the whys and wherefores for that, but I have plenty of information on the edc.ca website that goes into the whys and wherefores of why we believe that's the case. But if we see the economy that way, then it's a very different picture from what many are saying. Now, is all of this trade acrimony, everything that is going against globalization at the moment, going to wreck it all for us? Well, I choose to believe no, because we here in North America are the first ones that have a new trade deal that has been put together. And absent all of the rancor about tearing the deal up and globalization being a thing of the past and getting on with hegemonic and country-only isolationist policies was the way that we were going to go forward, we have actually seen inside of the CUSMA deal a strengthening of globalization. I can only imagine that in Washington, D.C., pieces of paper of that torn-up Trans-Pacific Partnership were being glued back together again because the key tenets of that policy were actually incorporated into ours, dealing with some of the most contentious trade issues that we have been wrangling about perhaps since the signing of the NAFTA deal itself. And I do also believe that the China-US trade spat is about strengthening globalization. I'm one of those perhaps fringe people who believes that Brexit is going to end ultimately well. And the reason for that is that the cost of not doing so is something that no politician wants to answer to his people for, or her people for. And so you may think, well, we're impossibly positive about things. We are confident enough in what it is that we are doing that we are encouraging Canadian businesses to do three things. One is to go for the gap that is being left behind by people who would prefer to sit on the sidelines. Process business, because where this is actually going is strengthening the position. If you grab that business now, you will be in much better shape than those who have sat on the sidelines. The second thing, though, is that for those that are sitting on the sidelines, investment is piling up. And if we're right, and trade deals are put into place, and it dawns on everybody that we're not wrecking our architecture, but strengthening it, that money is going to wash back into the economy. And I want Canadian exporters to be the first to be able to get that. I want the partners that they're dealing with in your countries to be the first to be able to cash in on this as well. So we are spreading this message around the world. And finally, I would say on the economy and where it is that we see it going, we believe that diversification is already happening around the world. And so to not officially or unofficially join this diversification move is not the wisest thing to do. Well, I welcome your comments and questions on my zany views of the world as I close my remarks. But let me be very clear. One thing I can say with absolute certainty is that in some way, maybe even in a big way, this will be an imperfect forecast. I believe that over my career, my forecasts have been unusually blessed. I've been able to make bold calls that have actually occurred, and I'm more than happy to go over those with you. Those are the moments I'd like to talk about. There are a lot of other very forgettable moments that I'd probably rather not discuss. It's sort of like life, isn't it? We have our high moments, and we have our low ones too. Well, I'm going to end on a more sober note. There are things out there that we can forecast with absolute certainty. And taxes are usually first on the list. Death is another thing that is absolutely certain for all of us. I'm not going to address taxes here today, but I do want to address death. It's a very sobering topic. But as I get older and witness the passing of family members, loved ones, heroes, mentors, and especially at the moment, beloved members of my parents' generation, I'm getting a whole new appreciation of the brevity of life and the need to prepare for that inevitability. Economy developments are going to come and go, but sometimes it's important to talk about serious life issues. Some, maybe all of us, desire in our lives to leave a legacy, something to provide for our offspring, either tangibly or on accumulated memories. You know, it's a notable and laudable desire. But I think that wise King Solomon and all of his accumulated wisdom, his innumerable possessions, his military might, his peaceful reign, his vast number of loved ones and offspring, and what did we see at the end of his life? A man tormented by existential ruminations of the meaning of it all. And it's at times vacuous response to the question of what comes next after life. And I think of our propensity to change, to forget the past in favor of the latest technology or innovation, about the temporariness of financial wealth, and wonder how easy it really is to hope that I personally will leave a lasting legacy. Others place their hope in living a good life, doing good deeds, developing and practicing principles and virtues that are good and wholesome and benefit others. These are also laudable. But I personally cannot depend on that, because as good a life as I may think I have lived, I have still made mistakes that blemish my record. And I've yet in my life to meet a perfect human. For me, placing hope in one's own goodness is a very risky venture. I don't know how much of a legacy I will leave. I hope to leave one, but I'm not placing my hope in it. And I've already admitted I'm far from perfect. So what is my reason for hope? As a young boy, I was maybe 8 years old at the time. I'm of Scottish heritage, and so managing finances means a lot to me. And I had taken out, with apologies to my Scottish friends here, I had taken out a library book, and I was way beyond the date where that book was to be put back in again. My fines were mounting by the day, and I was, as an 8-year-old, losing sleep, wondering, how am I going to pay this fine that grows every day? Well, finally I got to the point where I said, look, I can't pay for this thing, but I've at least got to stop the fine from mounting. So I walked into the library. There was a long lineup, and my turn came, and Mrs. Barrett was sitting there. And she was a very stern lady, so I thought, I'm never going to get this past her. And so I said, here's my book. She stamped it and moved it on. And I said, wait, what about the fine? And she said, don't worry about the fine. Well, I walked out of that, and I was walking on air. You know, as a Scottish person, to have, my fine canceled like that, it really meant something to me. Well, when I was 17 years old, I mounted a fine of a different kind. I was raised inside of the church. I knew better. And I walked away from all that I knew. In a very short period of time, I got myself into a lot of trouble. And I had something very remarkable happened to me at that point in time. Even although I had heard this message over and over again, it struck me with a new certainty. We're used to going through school, passing examinations. We're used to having deadlines and effectively examinations at work. And there are many religions, many beliefs, many creeds that have a notion that at the end of our lives, we will have an examination. How have we lived our lives? Are we right? Are we not? Are we in good terms with the divine? with our Maker. Well, that's an exam of all exams that I do not want to fail. But I already go to that with a failing record. I've made mistakes in my life. I have blemishes. I have sinned in my life, if we want to put it that way. I've done things that are wrong. I'm ashamed of those things. I cannot, on my own, erase those things. And what I learned when I was 17 stays with me to this day and burns inside of me, and that is that somebody at a point in history stood in my place and took the penalty for me. The Bible says that the wages of sin is death. The Bible also says in that same verse that the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. And what he did was documented in historical fact that could not be disputed, because Roman census systems that couldn't be disputed at that time chronicled exactly what he did in his life. And what was an undisputed fact at the time, and I believe to be an undisputed fact now, is that he lived a perfect life. He died in my place so that I could actually be made whole, perfect in the sight of the divine. Folks, that's what my hope rests in. And the fact that he was, as an historically documented fact, raised from the dead gives me hope that I can actually live this life in any kind of way that approximates his divine rules, his order. I wanted to share that with you today, because I don't know if you've wrestled in your life with the same thought, with wonders about life. Life churns. The economy rolls up and down. We have conflict in our lives that we deal with. But that certainty is going to happen to all of us. And I don't think there's a greater thing that I could share with you today than that experience that I had, which I believe is as real as anything that has happened to me in my life. And so I hope you will receive it in the love that it is transmitted to you, and I would be delighted to talk with any of you individually about that or about the economy if you want to as we part. So thank you very much for your kind attention. Please do enjoy your meal. Thank you.